All right, let's jump right into a theological puzzle that has kept scholars busy for, well, centuries. We're talking about the connection between Jesus and the Old Testament. And today, we're going to explore a really powerful theory that kind of reframes the whole conversation. It all starts with one absolutely crucial question.
And this is it. This is the big one. How did a group of fiercely monotheistic first-century Jews, people whose entire faith was built on the idea of one single, indivisible God, suddenly start worshiping a man from Nazareth, Jesus, as if he was God? On the surface, that looks like a total betrayal of everything they believed. It just doesn't seem to add up, right? Well, that's the mystery we're going to try and solve.
Okay, so the answer you usually hear is prophecy, right? The Old Testament predicted a Messiah, and hey, Jesus fulfilled those predictions. But while that's part of the story, for sure, it's also way too simple. It kind of misses the real point and doesn't get to the heart of a much deeper, much trickier theological problem.
So that simple view is basically a checklist. Prophecy A, check. Prophecy B, check. But the deeper problem is all about identity. See, the New Testament writers do something really audacious. They don't just say Jesus is the Messiah. They take verses and titles that were only ever used for YHWH, for God himself, and they apply them directly to Jesus. So the real question isn't, did he check the boxes? It's, how on earth could they call a man God without completely blowing up their own faith?
So where do we even start to look for an answer? Well, what's so fascinating about this whole theory is that it says the key isn't in the New Testament at all. Nope. It argues the clues have been there all along, hiding in plain sight, deep inside the Hebrew Scriptures. It's a pattern that scholars have a name for, divine two-ness.
Okay, so what in the world is divine two-ness? Well, think of it like this. It's this recurring thing in the Old Testament where God seems to have a kind of double existence. On the one hand, he's the transcendent, totally invisible God up in heaven. But at the same time, he sometimes shows up on earth as a visible figure, maybe as a man or an angel, who is also called YHWH. Now, this is absolutely critical. This is not two different gods. It's a complexity, a depth, inside the identity of the one God of Israel.
And this story makes it super clear. So in Genesis, Hagar is talking with the angel of the Lord. Seems straightforward, but then look at her conclusion. She says she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. She gets it. She knows that by seeing this angel, she has had a direct encounter with God himself. The text treats them as distinct, but also identical. Wild, right?
And you might be thinking, okay, that's one weird story about an angel, but it's not a one-off thing. Not at all. This pattern pops up in other ways too, like the name of God wasn't just letters on a page. It was seen as God's power and presence made tangible. The presence of God could be a visible thing, like a pillar of fire. It all points to the same idea, finding a way for an infinite, invisible God to show up in our physical world.
All right, I know what you're probably thinking. This is all just fancy reading of old texts, right? Did anyone actually think this way back then? And the answer is a resounding yes. This is where the history gets really, really interesting, because it turns out this whole idea of two-ness was a live debate long before Jesus ever showed up on the scene. Let's just trace the idea. First, way back, you have the Old Testament texts themselves, the ones with this strange two-ness pattern. Then, fast forward to what's called the Second Temple period, basically the time right before and during Jesus' life. Jewish scholars are wrestling with these exact passages, and a whole debate springs up that some called the two powers in heaven idea. So, and this is the key, when the first Christians come along, they are not pulling this idea out of thin air. They're jumping right into a conversation that was already happening. So, this whole two powers thing, it was a genuine stream of Jewish thought. It was exploring how a second, powerful, divine figure could exist alongside God, sharing his identity and authority without breaking monotheism. Now, was it controversial? Oh yeah, for sure, but, and this is so important, it wasn't automatically considered heresy by everyone at the time. The mental framework, the possibility of a second divine figure, it was already on the table.
Okay, so this is where it all comes together. This is the big reveal. The New Testament writers didn't need to invent the idea of a second God. That conceptual box was already there, waiting to be ticked. Their explosive, history-making move wasn't proposing the idea of a second YHWH figure, it was making the identification. They pointed to this specific person, Jesus of Nazareth, and said, that's him. He is that figure. And how did they make that case? Well, they went right back to their own scriptures. They grabbed passages like this one from Isaiah, which, already kind of blurs the lines between a promised human king and these jaw-dropping divine titles like Mighty God.
These verses were their ammunition. They were the scriptural launchpad for the incredible claim they were about to make. So let's just boil it down to the core move here. The number one strategy you see the New Testament authors use over and over again is this. They take passages that are, without any doubt, originally about YHWH, the God of Israel, and they just redirect them. They aim them squarely at Jesus. This is so much more than calling him a great teacher. It's a conscious, deliberate act of divine identification.
And it's like they had a playbook with 3 main moves. First, like we just said, repurpose the YHWH texts. Second, have Jesus use that famous I am language. You know, the same thing God said to Moses at the burning bush. That's not subtle. And third, they always put Jesus on the creator side of that ultimate dividing line, never on the creature side. Every single one of these tactics was designed to make one point crystal clear. Hey, remember that second YHWH figure we've all been reading about in the scriptures? Well, we've met.
So we've gone through all this. What's the big deal? Why does looking at the Bible this way even matter? Well, it completely changes the game for how you see the Old and New Testaments fitting together. It really changes what you think the New Testament is even trying to claim in the first place. Let's put the 2 ways of thinking side by side. On one hand, you've got the simple prediction/fulfillment model, and it's fine. It basically turns the Old Testament into a list of forecasts. But then you have this theological grammar model, which is so much richer. It says the Old Testament isn't just a book of predictions. It's the dictionary and the grammar book you need to even understand the sentence, Jesus is God. It gives you the very categories for who God is. So Jesus isn't just checking boxes. He's the living identification of a divine reality that was already woven right into the fabric of Israel's scriptures.
And that's really the bottom line. According to this framework, the divinity of Jesus isn't some foreign idea that later Christians just forced onto the Hebrew Bible. No way. Instead, it's presented as an internal development, a claim that grows organically right out of the soil of the Old Testament's own complex, fascinating theology of God.
So we're left with one final kind of mind-bending thought to chew on. If this theory is correct, if the categories for understanding Jesus as divine are already baked into the Hebrew Bible, then what does it really mean to call the Old Testament a Christian book? Is it an adopted text, or is there a much deeper, more intrinsic connection there from the very beginning? That's a pretty big thought to leave you with.